Very much for inviting me again to the AGM to be the guest speaker. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person because I had real good fun last time. Everybody got really involved, so I apologise for that part of the talk being missing. I'm just to let you know, anybody who doesn't know me, I'm a reader, what's called a reader, one down from a professor, I will get there eventually, at Wolverhampton University. And I specialise in, amongst other things, I specialised in the Victorian convict prison system. So today's talk, which is entitled As Gentlemanly a Little Fellow as Ever Stepped, The Life and Times of a Victorian Prison Governor, is going to be about a guy who I've become somewhat obsessed by, a chap called Major Robert John Hickey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him, about his life and his times before he was a Victorian governor, and then I shall go on to talk about what he actually did as a Victorian convict prison governor. Robert John Hickey was born at sea on the East India Company ship Lady Flora on the 30th of May 1827. The ship was captained by Lieutenant Robert John Farrer, after whom Hickey was named, and Robert John Farrer himself was a very interesting chap. He later went on to become the governor of a convict prison hulk in Bermuda. And the ship was en route from Bengal to Portsmouth. Hickey came from what was known as a good family. Sir Walter Raleigh was a distant ancestor on his mother's side, and as the son of an East India Company employee, he initially followed a military path, being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Bengal European Regiment, which later became the Bengal Fusiliers and is now been renamed the Royal Munster Fusiliers, in June 1845. And on the 20th of August 1845, he sailed for Calcutta on the P&O paddle steamer Oriental, later being commissioned as a first lieutenant on the 17th of June 1848. He enjoyed quite a successful military career. He was awarded a medal and a clasp after seeing action in Pegu, which is now in modern-day Burma or Myanmar, in 1852 and 53, and he was commissioned as a captain on the 7th of June 1857. He retired from the Indian Army on full pay on the 3rd of August 1864, so he was only 37 years old, and upon retirement he was made a brevet or honorary major. And like so many of his military colleagues, he seems to have sought employment in another highly disciplined arena, that of a convict prison. So between November 1864 and December 1867, he served as Deputy Governor at Portland Convict Prison on the Isle of Wight, and in December 1867 he was appointed as Deputy Governor at Dartmoor Prison. And he succeeded a Captain Butt, B-U-T-T, as Governor of Dartmoor Prison on the 6th of January 1870 and remained there until the 11th of October 1872. Unfortunately, we don't have, despite the fact he was an Army Major and a Victorian convict prison governor, and the fact that I'm in touch with his 3 times great-granddaughter, nobody has any photographs of the guy. But we do have a contemporary account of his appearance when he was Deputy Governor at Dartmoor. And he's described by a convict who wrote his memoirs later as following, quote, "With his back to the fireplace behind the chief warder stood a gentleman in mufti, who I need not at second glance to see was a soldier likewise. This was the Deputy Governor, as gentlemanly a little fellow as ever stepped, and to whom I cannot but think the duties of a governor must have been very repugnant. Except when in his office and prisoners were brought before him on report, I do not think Captain H was ever known to speak before a prisoner. He never, however, let a thing escape him, and any remark he had to make, he made to the principal warder on duty." I will return later in the talk to his life as prison governor, but first I want to talk about an incident that I'm sure he'd rather have everybody liked to have kept quiet about. Now, Hickey married a lady called Mary Taylor Hume on the 5th of February 1856 in Jersey, and the marriage appears to have been a very successful and a very happy one. They had 11 children, all of whom, somewhat unusually, survived to adulthood. However, a couple of years before he married, he also apparently penned the following racy letter to his sweetheart. This was very racy for mid-Victorian Britain. So I will now read the letter. It's rather a long letter. "My own darling, I commenced this before receiving yours to save time. The paper is all ready for you, but you must send me a pencil to sharpen for you, as this is the only one I have. Your voice last evening almost drove me mad. I longed to kiss you after you had done singing. How proud I should be if you were my own. Do you recollect last evening taxing me with knowing one of the servants on board? They were actually on board a ship bound back from Calcutta to Mauritius, better than I ought. Suppose I did, you could not blame me. So long as you reject that brute's advances, so alone can you expect me to remain yours alone, and right willingly would I do it for years if you could do so also. I cannot tell you how I love you. How and why have you thus seduced my affections? I have seen hundreds of girls in India who would have given all they possessed, worlds if they had it, to gain my love. Obviously got a high opinion of himself. None of them succeeded. This is the important bit though. Why have you, a married woman, with such a barrier to our happiness? But I shall live on in hope. Oh, do not forget me when you are in another land. Think of him who would do anything to keep your love steadfast. My sweetheart, if we could but remain at Mauritius and there revel in bliss, what ecstasy of delight. Do you love me still? Do you? Tell me, sweet, I fancy asking you this, and this is the racy bit, as I lie beside you with my head resting on your bosom, my black head between those snowy orbs. Daring stuff from mid-Victorian Britain. I was thinking last evening if it was possible for you to come to Mrs. Waters' cabin with her while the people on board were at tea. I want to seal our engagement with a kiss. Yours alone, Robert. However, as you've probably figured out, this was not a letter to his wife-to-be. This was in fact a letter to Mrs. Anna Maria Hill, who was travelling with her husband from Calcutta back to England via Mauritius. Now, theirs was not a happy marriage, and in 1857 she and her husband separated. And in 1864, Robert Hickey was named, and it was widely published throughout in the Times and other newspapers, he was named as the co-respondent in a bitter judicial separation case at the Court for Divorce and Matrimonial Causes. And the case, along with Hickey's name, was widely publicised in the London and regional papers. It may therefore not be mere coincidence that he retired from the army a few months later at the age of only 37. I can't prove this, but the scandal may have caused ructions within the senior military. But whatever the reason, he now had to seek another career. And as described above, he decided on a career within the prison service. And the rest of my talk will now deal with his day-to-day life as governor of one of what was then one of the largest and most notorious convict prisons in Britain, i.e. Dartmoor. As any of you have been there, to Dartmoor, not the prison I hasten to add, it's a pretty lonely and bleak spot. It's fantastic for walking and bird watching, but not so much fun, I imagine, being a convict there in Victorian Britain. And Dartmoor was actually the oldest convict prison in Britain. It's, in fact, the oldest working prison in Britain. It was originally founded in 1806 to 1809. It closed after about 1820 and reopened as a convict prison in 1850, and it still serves as a prison. Now, the convict prison system was developed in the 1850s as a replacement for transportation to Australia for those deemed serious offenders. I think I mentioned as a previous talk that just under 170,000 men, women and children were transported from Australia to Australia between 1787 and 1868. But from the 1850s, instead of being forcibly banished halfway across the world, such offenders would now have to serve a minimum of 3 years and a maximum of life imprisonment in a convict prison, undergoing a sentence of what was known as penal servitude. This involved very hard labour, a subsistence diet, and an extremely harsh discipline. For example, silence was enforced, as was separation, apart from when the convicts were working, exercising, and eating. During his time at Dartmoor, Hickey appears to have been a fairly diligent and conscientious governor, though he was noted as a harsh disciplinarian. And a convict who wrote an account of his time at Dartmoor certainly had a higher opinion of him than of Hickey's predecessor. Quote, Captain Butt, who was his predecessor, was but a popinjay in office. He had as much to do with the management of the prison as a Russian cavalry colonel had to do with the navigation of a man of war he is through court interest appointed in command of. Hickey was a vigilant man himself, and though he said so little, nothing ever escaped him. Luckily, Major H looked sharp after everything, and the discipline of the place was kept up. It was not long before every man in the prison, officers and men, had a very wholesome respect for the Major, end quote. So what did Hickey do as governor? Well, he stated in his evidence to an 1877 Parliamentary Commission on Prisons that much of his time was spent walking through the prison. He stated, quote, "I am constantly visiting different parts of the prison or wards," end quote, and he also interacted with prisoners on a daily basis. He stated, quote, "I see them at a certain time every day in my own office for the purpose of receiving complaints from the prisoner," end quote. He was also proud of the fact that he did make some improvements to the lot of convicts. He told the commissioners that he increased the exercise time available to convicts by giving an extra 5 or 10 minutes to allow for them for the time spent falling in for the daily parade, which they had to attend. Although it was pointed out by his interviewer that what he'd actually done was simply to restore the exercise time to what it should have been in the first place. And another convict also pointed out that the food, which was always and still remains an important consideration in the daily routine of a prisoner, had improved under Hickey's governorship. When questioned, quote, "In what respect is it better?" end quote, he stated, quote, "We used to get soup twice a week thickened with gruel. Now it is thickened with meat," end quote. And when further asked, quote, "When did it begin to improve?" end quote, the convict replied, quote, "Since this present governor came here. And the potatoes we used to get at dinner used to be bad. Now we don't get any bad ones. They used to be rotten. The food is better looked after now than it ever was before," end quote. The often mundane aspects of Hickey's work as a governor are the most immediately apparent when perusing his journal entries. Every governor of all prisons had to keep a daily log of outgoing correspondence, and Hickey has survived for 1871 to 1872. And if you look at these journal entries, which are available at Dartmoor Prison Museum, much of his time was spent informing other prison governors and the police officers of the imminent arrival of convicts due for release on licence. So licence was a form of parole, still going today. After serving a certain amount of time, convicts, if they behaved themselves well, could gain early release. He was also frequently contacting carriage contractors or omnibus contractors in order to arrange the conveyance of convicts and officers to and from Plymouth railway station, whereby they were then dispersed on licence, normally through London. He also had numerous arguments with the suppliers of materials for convict labour projects. For example, he frequently complained about the quality of leather received for use in the making of Metropolitan Police officers' boots. And I find it quite ironic, I'm sure that the convicts did as well, that the very boots used by the police to give chase to and capture offenders were actually made at the time by convicts at Dartmoor. He also had the unenviable task of informing relatives of convicts' deaths within custody, and his letters to grieving parents and relatives appear to be somewhat businesslike and lacking in sympathy to modern eyes, so the following is a description. He wrote this to Mrs. John Evans. "I regret having to inform you of the death of prisoner Richard Evans, 8778, that was the convict prisoner's number, which took place in the infirmary of this prison at 2:35 p.m. this day. A coroner's inquest will be held on the body in the course of a few days, after which his remains will be interred in the churchyard of the village of Princeton, at either of which you or any of his friends may be present." Seems somewhat cold and impersonal in modern day eyes. Convicts who died were buried in the churchyard very close to the prison, and if anybody's been lucky enough to visit Dartmoor Prison or the museum, or indeed Princeton, many of their gravestones can still be seen. And in contrast, a few of the entries are unintentionally somewhat humorous. For example, his reply concerning the late delay of a particular item hints at a mild desperation and bemusement. So he writes to, these were actually benefactors of, there were 6 Jewish prisoners in Dartmoor at the time, and he writes to the benefactors, "In reply to your letter of the 15th instant, I have to inform you that the Passover cake sent from London for the use of the Jews at this prison was delivered here from Tavistock by the South Devon Railway Company's carriers this day, i.e. it was delivered about 8 days late. And as the feast is over, I beg to be informed what is done with the cake." What is to be done with the cake? So we'd obviously been left with a stale Passover cake. Now, although it seems somewhat humorous, as Passover was celebrated from the 6th to the 13th of April in 1871, these convicts must have been, in actual fact, bitterly disappointed by the failure of the South Devon Railway to deliver the cake on time. Any change to the monotonous diet would have been eagerly anticipated, quite apart from the religious significance of the item concerned. Now, Hickey's tenure at Dartmoor Prison appears to have ended somewhat suddenly. and it's very difficult to find out what actually happened. His name in the Governor's Journal is summarily replaced by that of Major James Farquharson, formerly of Brixton Prison, on the 11th of October 1872. Hickey writes one letter in the morning, and the next entry in the afternoon is under the name of Farquharson on the same day. His removal is unexplained, but it clearly generated a great deal of further change because it had the knock-on effect. So many people were changed in their role of deputy governor to governor, promoted from deputy governor to governor, or taken from one prison to another. Now, there's some evidence that it was a dismissal, perhaps as a result of the obvious enmity exhibited between Hickey and the above-mentioned prison chaplain, Reverend James Francis. Now, these two hated each other's guts, and he complained, Francis had complained to both the Director of Convict Prisons and the Home Office about Hickey's alleged harsh punishments of prisoners in the late 1870 and early 1871, before himself resigning in 1872. And the crux of the matter was that Hickey was apparently in the habit of issuing successive punishments, usually consisting of putting the offender on a bread and water diet, for what the Reverend Francis regarded as a continuing single offence by often, quote, half-witted, end quote, convicts. And in a parliamentary inquiry report of 1878, the Reverend Francis stated, quote, "I thought there was an unreasonable exercise of discipline, a harsh exercise of discipline under Major Hickey. There grew up this course of discipline which I considered harsh," end quote. These complaints may have sealed Hickey's fate, although the Reverend Francis stated in his evidence to the Kimberley Commission report in 1878, the visiting director of convict prisons, who was in charge of the overall prison system, had clearly sided with Hickey. He states, quote, "The visiting director appeared to me to give his whole countenance and influence to the governor in what I regarded from my standpoint as incorrect treatment," end quote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the chairman of the directors of convict prisons, Edmund Duquesne, who was noted for his strict disciplinarian stance, also sided with Hickey. And he indignantly remarked in his evidence to the Kimberley Commission that it, quote, "was clearly a most outrageous thing that he should be allowed," i.e. the chaplain, "should be allowed to gibbet that governor before the public as a culprit from his own imperfect knowledge of the matter, and in opposition to the views of those who had inquired into it impartially," end quote. So what had happened? There was numerous in the governor's journals. There are numerous examples of the enmity between Hickey and Francis. But whatever the reason, Dartmoor was the last prison governorship held by Hickey. He never held another post in the prison service again. He had a very varied career afterwards. He subsequently became a manager of the school supply company, then a director of the wonderfully titled Swiss Unsweetened Pure Milk Company, which manufactured condensed milk. He also briefly owned a photographic studio for a short while. And he also, interestingly, gave numerous local talks to local societies, both on his previous role as a prison governor, and somewhat strangely, he was noted for talks on how to cook frugally without the need for a maid or a cook. And he died in 1889, several years before his wife, leaving an estate of £1,120, 6 shillings and 11 pence. That concludes my talk on Major Hickey, a very brief talk about Hickey's life and times as a prison governor.